From the studios of the Optimism Institute, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast. I'm your host, Bill Burke, and in every Blue Sky episode, we'll be speaking to leaders, researchers, and thinkers whose stories and insights will remind us that there is always blue sky above. Sometimes you just have to get your head above the clouds to see it. We've had many guests on this show who've been involved with and impacted by nonprofit organizations. My guest today is someone who shines a light on this large and important part of our society and economy as the founder and leader of the nonprofit sector's leading publication. Stacy Palmer is chief executive of the Chronicle of Philanthropy and has overseen the organization's transition as it became an independent nonprofit itself in April 2023. Palmer helped found the Chronicle in 1988 when it was started by the Chronicle of Higher Education. She has served as its top editor since 1996. Under Stacy Palmer's leadership, the Chronicle of Philanthropy has evolved from its roots as a bi-weekly newspaper for social sector professionals into an organization that offers a monthly magazine, robust news, advice, and opinion sections, a podcast, and a host of webinars, briefings, and other services. Stacy has appeared frequently on radio and television to offer commentary on news in the nonprofit world. She's the editor of Challenges for Philanthropy and Nonprofits, a book published by the University Press of New England. I hope you enjoy this blue sky conversation with Stacy Palmer as much as I did. Stacy Palmer, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's great to have you on. I'm excited to talk about the subject of philanthropy. It's something I think is certainly important in this country and other places, and you meet a lot of inspiring people in the process. I'd love to start with how the Chronicle of Philanthropy came about. As I understand it, you were involved with the Chronicle of Higher Education, and then at some point it spun off or you added this new title. Could you just talk about how that happened and why?
Yeah. One of the things that happened, and this was about 40 years ago, I was just 12.
Yeah, right. Born in the lobby, as they say.
Yes, that's right. So the nonprofit world was becoming much more professionalized, and it was growing really, really fast. And so at the Chronicle of Higher Education, we were covering colleges and universities. And all of a sudden, we noticed that a lot of the people we respected most were leaving colleges and going to work at museums and hospitals and all of those kinds of things to help them raise money or to do leadership jobs. And it was because these organizations were growing so fast that the only place that there was a lot of talent was in the higher education world. There just wasn't this idea that we groom professionals to do this kind of work. And so we started thinking about why was that happening? What did it mean? What was its significance? And at that same time, some people who worked at nonprofits came to us and said, we are becoming more professional. Professionals need a journal of record. This was before there was an internet. There was no way of them connecting with each other. And would you consider doing what the Chronicle of Higher Education did for colleges and universities, drawing them all together and do it for the nonprofit world? Because we think this is a moment. So that was really inspiring to us. But what we also realized was that journalists were not paying nearly enough attention to the world of nonprofits. People thought that nonprofits, that all they did was throw ritzy galas and, and maybe you'd write about them at Thanksgiving and Christmas and, the kinds of things that they were doing around the holidays, but they otherwise weren't interesting. And so we realized there was this really rich world that deserved better coverage. So all those things came together and we said, let's create a news organization that covers nonprofits, will be the trade publication for the field, but will also influence how other journalists cover this and show that there's really serious journalism to be done here.
Fantastic. And I think it surprises people, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, maybe you know them, but the sheer number of nonprofits, the sheer percentage of Americans who work for nonprofits, the percent who give, it's a significant part of our culture and, frankly, our
It
economy.
truly is. 1 in every 10 Americans works
1 in
for a
10.
nonprofit
Amazing.
organization.
So you've been at this ever since, and so there must be, I imagine, something about the subject of philanthropy, philanthropists themselves, that engage you, inspire you. What can you describe what those might be?
Well, as you can imagine, everybody who's in this work is trying to change the world in some way. And what keeps it interesting is that they all have different ways of trying to figure out, how do we make a difference? What do we really do? And as the world has new problems to conquer, you have to learn about what those challenges are and how nonprofits need to deal with them. I mean, when we first started, we weren't writing a lot about climate change. Now, of course, we are all the time. So, you sort of grapple with the subjects. People who are involved in nonprofits, whether they're the ones who are giving the money away or the ones who are using it or volunteers, they all have different ideas based on what they learn from what they're doing about what truly works to make a difference. And that's what keeps it lively and interesting all the time, and incredibly inspiring, because people often there's something in their lives that causes them to want to take on a specific challenge. And that's just always super interesting. And then there are other times people are motivated by the idea that they really didn't like being in the corporate world. They didn't like being in government. They hated being a lawyer. And they often it's that, and that they wanted to find a different way to really feel that they're contributing and making a difference.
Yeah, and I think it can be particularly inspiring too, because nobody gets into a nonprofit or philanthropy to get famous, to get rich. Those things are usually not the accoutrements of a nonprofit life. And in a culture that celebrates that sort of thing, it's kind of a bold thing to do. So you mentioned when you formed the Chronicle that there was a moment that philanthropy was changing, that it was becoming more professional. What sort of changes have you seen in the time since then? How has philanthropy evolved in these many years that you've been covering it?
Well, as you can imagine, there's tons more money being given away as we've seen, the growth of the very wealthy. So, the biggest difference is the fact, and unfortunately, because there's wealth inequality, there's also more reason to be giving. But, there just weren't these zillion-dollar fortunes that there are now. So, we covered things like the rise of Bill and Melinda Gates giving these phenomenal amounts of money. And there was a period during the tech boom where they were getting very wealthy. And every couple months, their PR people would call me and say, "We're about to make a big gift. Be ready on Friday." And they'd give $5 billion, and then they'd give $5 billion. And every time they were setting records, nobody was giving $5 billion at a time. So that rise of sort of the mega philanthropists and the idea that they were living donors. When we started, it was mostly people who had died and left a bequest. So you never really knew the people who left the money for, you'd hear something about what their motivations were, but you weren't hearing directly from them. And so the biggest thing I think we've seen is that rise in the influence of these living donors. The sort of difficult part that we've witnessed is, even though there's been this phenomenal growth of that big giving, is the share of Americans who give has dropped precipitously. So when we started, 2/3 of Americans were giving to charity, and now it's less than 50%.
Interesting. So there's a lot there. One. I don't know if I've shared this with you before, Stacy, but I worked with Ted Turner and helped write his autobiography, and I was actually at a dinner in New York the night before he announced his gift to create the United Nations Foundation, and he was telling everybody in this loud voice, and he said, "I'm going to give $1 billion to the UN." And at the time, his net worth had grown in that past year from 2 billion to 3 billion after the Time Warner merger. So he pledged a third of his wealth. And then what he did, you may recall, and you probably covered it at the time, he went around and shamed all the other billionaires, including Bill Gates. And Bill Gates Sr. actually acknowledged that Ted was one of the ones who got his son to get off the dime and do something. So sometimes it takes a start. I don't think Ted's always gotten the credit for that. I'm wondering if that stirs any memories for you.
No, you really You're right. He inspired this mega philanthropy boom and this idea, and it led to something that we still do today, which is we rank the 50 people who give the most in the United States, which is an idea that he had to say it's silly that we have only the Forbes 400, which is the accumulation of money. We ought to rank people by how much they give away.
Yes, I'm glad you remember, because I'm wildly biased about Ted, but that's something he doesn't always get the credit for, so I appreciate that. 10% of Americans work in nonprofits, and they are generally people hoping to make a positive difference in the world. And these are facts that, taken together, should give us all a great sense of optimism. And speaking of someone who has contributed to my own belief in the power of optimism, I was glad that Stacy quickly recognized Ted Turner's impact on big gift philanthropy, both through his own generosity and by encouraging other super wealthy people to give more. Ranking people not by their net worth, but by how much they give away was Ted's idea many years ago, and it's great to hear that Stacy's publication is still doing just that. By the way, the top giver on 2024's list was Michael Bloomberg at $3.7 billion, followed by Netflix founder Reed Hastings and his wife Patty Quillen at $1.59 billion, and Susan and Michael Dell at $1.46 billion. Impressive numbers all around. Now, back to our conversation. Another thing, you said that individual giving's down to 50% of Americans. It's my understanding that while that is lower than it's been, it's still way ahead of the rest of the world. That now, and a lot of European countries, I think it's 10% or lower. Now, some of my European friends would counter and say, well, that's because our government takes care of a lot of these basic needs. We don't need to fill that gap. But it does seem to me that there's something in the American ethos and history that has caused us to be more philanthropic. Is that something you can reflect on?
Yeah, no, there's definitely the tradition of giving that has always been part of it. It's not always financial giving. It's also volunteering, being involved, being part of community. And I do think a piece of it is the fact that we don't have as many government social services, so there's more of a need for a safety net. But I think people feel like that there's at least a strand that feels that it's more effective to have community members coming up with these are the things that our community needs, these are the kinds of services, that one-on-one reaching out. And then, there are plenty of nonprofits that are involved in other causes like, environmental advocacy, criminal justice, all the other things that people want to get involved in. So the world of charitable giving, it's huge. And the number of organizations, there are 1.6 million organizations. Some of them are small things like little leagues and things like that. I mean, they're not all, these big organizations like the Red Cross, but we do have that tradition for sure.
Speaking of the government taking care of these things, and we generally avoid the subject of politics on this show because that's well served by many others out there. But just say, there are people who feel like, and there's been cuts of late to a lot of aid organizations, a lot of nonprofits that get sizable amounts from the federal government. And sometimes people who believe that those cuts are a good idea will say, well, if it's so important, then individuals will step up. Now you mentioned that percentage of participation is down, but have you seen any of that where people are stepping in where these cuts were made to fill those gaps? Is that something that's actually happened and that you've covered?
Yeah, it absolutely is. One of the more interesting recent cuts was to public broadcasting. And the number of individuals who have stepped up has been phenomenal. Plus, a group of foundations and wealthy philanthropists also created a bridge fund to be able to help the organizations figure out what the next steps are. So I think, and I've talked to international aid organizations that, they were among the first ones that were cut. They put out emergency appeals and people responded very generously. That said, every single one of them and foundations and philanthropists have also cautioned that the amount of money available in philanthropy is tiny compared to what government provided. I talked to a foundation leader the other day who said her endowment could provide 6 hours of government services if they spent it all right now. So, we can't think of the idea, certainly as a band-aid, philanthropy can step in and can be a help, but the amount of money that even the wealthiest foundations, like the Gates Foundation, like the Lilly Endowment, they do not have enough resources compared to government to fill that gap.
Interesting. I'd like to stay on media for a second because you just made me think of another area where nonprofits have, in some ways, changed a role in the newspaper business, which I have a background in media and I've got involved with some papers in the state of Maine. There's been the whole category has been challenged and the newspaper business is just in a terrible spot. But there are people who believe that it's an important function in local government in particular. And it's been interesting to watch and happen to the biggest papers in the state of Maine where nonprofits have stepped in to take those over. Have you seen that in your experience in newspapers, but any other areas that maybe in the past were for profit that for various reasons have morphed more into the nonprofit model?
Yeah, so definitely in the nonprofit news world, and we went from being a for-profit into the nonprofit because we thought that this is where all the cool kids are now. And it's really because there's so much innovation that you can do as a nonprofit. There are a lot of reasons why that makes sense. It's a hard road for nonprofits just as it is for profits because you still have to pay. Just because you're nonprofit doesn't mean that you don't have to pay for things. Of course you do. It's just that where the profits go, you can plow that money back into the cause and the organization. So that's what makes the nonprofit structure more important. But you still have to have the same revenue diversification and do all of those kinds of things. That's a great question about what's becoming nonprofit. I- You know, we saw a wave of conversions, maybe the other way around, where healthcare organizations that were nonprofit, became for profit. So I think that's more common than the other way around. But maybe these media organizations will pave the way for others.
Yeah, and I think with things like newspapers and we're seeing it now with public media is sort of, the old song, you don't know what you've got till it's gone. And people think, oh my gosh, if we didn't have a local newspaper. And sometimes I think people in those declining industries, you can sound like the boy who cried wolf. Oh, we're going down the tubes. And I was like, yeah, you'll be fine. You just sort of take it for granted. Then all of a sudden it's like, well, wait a second, this could go away. And that's where I think there is a pretty strong threat in this country of people saying, okay, that's we can't have that. We got to step up. Now, one thing, this is coming to you from the studios of the Optimism Institute, and I'd like to try to make that connection. I've said on this platform many times that not every optimist is an entrepreneur, but every entrepreneur had better be an optimist. And and I think nonprofit founders are certainly a form of entrepreneur. I'd love to hear your thoughts on when you've covered these things, this role of optimism as an ethos, as a mindset for anyone getting involved in the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors.
Yeah, you have to believe that change is possible. That's why you're going into this. Most of the organizations that are nonprofit are in some way about, even if it's like improving cultural vitality, making sure that, an arts organization needs to believe that its work makes a difference. And so it can be a very traditional thing that we don't think of change maybe at a museum, but of course they're changing all the time to attract new audiences or to think about different ways of presenting something. Or if you're trying to solve some social problem, like making sure that when people leave prison that they have good jobs and that they're prepared to re-enter society, you believe that those people can make a difference and should make a difference, and that with the right support that they can do that. So almost everybody who goes into, I don't think I've met a pessimist actually among the people that we've covered. Now, to be sure, they're more tempered by reality, right? That's different than the belief that you individuals can make a difference and that collectively we can make a difference, and that we need to keep going at it. So yes, this is a very optimistic line of work.
One of my guests on this show is a man named Bert Jacobs, who co-founded the Life is Good company, the apparel company. And he has a great line, which is, I challenge people to bring me the list of history's great pessimists. And I think that would apply to philanthropy and nonprofits. Great. There's just no list. It's good to hear that in the wake of recent cuts of federal government funds to nonprofits, the private sector has filled in some of these gaps. But it's important to understand that huge shortfalls remain. And as people working for nonprofits fundraise and do their other challenging work, Stacy believes that an optimistic attitude is vital. She emphasizes that you have to believe that change is possible and that the work you're doing is making a difference. Getting back to our conversation, I wanted to learn more about Stacy Palmer's podcast. Let's talk about your podcast, Nonprofits Now. And it seems in your tenure, you mentioned when you started this Chronicle, there was no internet. And I'm sure you moved a lot of your journalism online, and there were no podcasts either. Tell us about your podcast, what you're hoping to accomplish with it, the kind of subjects you cover, guests you have, that sort of thing.
Great. Thank you for asking about it. And so in our first season, what we decided we wanted to do was focus on nonprofit leaders and hear directly from them, with their advice, their thoughts for other leaders, to make sure that it was grounded in reality rather than just talking to a bunch of experts who might not have been on the job and actually doing it. And so we did a survey to understand what it was that the challenges facing nonprofit leaders. And as you can imagine from the things we've talked about already today, it's challenging to lead a nonprofit. You have to inspire people to make those changes that you believe are really important. You need to raise money to do it. You need to keep the talent really engaged in it, make sure that people are doing a good job. And it's interesting because I think it connects to what you asked me about optimism. Because you feel so strongly that things need to change, you kind of drive yourself very hard. And so there's a lot of burnout in this field, largely self imposed, because people feel really strongly that they need to make a difference. So they're constantly, moving. And we knew that because people were burning out so fast, we wanted to do something to try to help people understand how they could lead their organizations better, what kinds of things work, and what makes a difference. So, we talked about things like making sure that your board members are helping you, making sure that the people in your organization, that they're doing well, that you're running a great workplace, that maybe if it's important to be family friendly, that you are, depending on what your organization is all about. Organizations are, until the financial crisis that we've had in the past few months came about, their biggest challenge was attracting talent because there's so much competition for it. So we talk a lot about what keeps employees productive. And, the big thing, obviously, workplace flexibility is important, but what today's workers, and I think this is true in nonprofit and for profit, they want to grow. They want to grow as people, professionally, and do those kinds of things. So the organizations that are doing the best are those that really offer as many professional development opportunities for their staff as possible. So we talk about sort of how they do it, how people network with other leaders, all those kinds of things, but very much from a real world perspective. And the closing question we have at the end of every podcast is aimed at that burnout question of, we ask people, what is it that you do to make sure that you stay well, and that you do have free time? And every single one of the people we talked to said, I make sure that I do things like take my vacation, and I want a role model for people. And I know I need breaks. I need to get out in nature. And Valerie Jarrett, who's head of the Obama Foundation, said, okay, I admit to you that I watch some TV shows that I won't even tell you about as my break. Here she's worked in the Obama administration, she's done all those things. And you have this vision of her putting up her feet with, watching junk television. But she also said, what gives me great pleasure is, it's those random acts of kindness. I'm in the grocery store and somebody needs a hand lifting something, doing something, paying for something. Just those kinds of one-on-one activities make you feel so good and so connected to the rest of the world that we all need to take time out to do that.
Absolutely. And I'm really glad that your show has that emphasis, because I think there's a perception out there sometimes that, there's for-profits and startups, and then there's nonprofits, and that the nonprofit, especially, the sort of in the startup phase, if you will, people rarely use the term startup, it seems to me, with nonprofits, but it's the same thing. It is just as hard, if not harder. And partly, I think it's harder, especially to motivate your folks. It goes back to something I said before. There are a lot of startups where they're working people into the ground, but with this promise of, oh, we're going to go public, or you've got stock options, or you've got this pot of gold, or whatever. On the nonprofit side, A, that's not there. And B, usually by definition, the social issue that you're working on is really tough. And you may be at it for a couple of years and seeing very little, if any, improvement. So it's got to be that much more of a grind, I would think.
It absolutely is, because most of the problems we're trying to solve are long term, they're complicated things. So, yes, you can have milestones, but you're going to be at it for a long time. And the other part that is challenging is that people don't take nonprofit work seriously. They don't think of people as professionals. So, I think it's better than it was when we first started. Nobody thought of anybody in nonprofit as at all professional. But even today, how are we going to attract the best talent if it isn't seen as legitimate as a career to do this kind of work and to devote your life to it, in the same way that people are attracted to business or law or government work?
Yeah, well, I can vouch for that. I've sat on a large, pretty big number of nonprofit boards, and some of the finest leaders and people I've ever met are in that sector. And from the bigger ones like healthcare to the smaller startups like science organizations and those sorts of things, just really impressive people. And it's great you're putting a spotlight on that. Speaking of that, are there individuals or organizations that you're particularly inspired by and that you would hope more people would know about and celebrate?
Yeah, that's like asking you to choose among your children. And I think the organizations that are always really attractive are those that, somebody has an idea that to solve a problem that nobody really realized was there, and how their creativity that comes about. You know, Often in the education arena, for example, there will be people who are the first folks in their family to graduate from college, and then they come up with ideas to provide the support, for example, of how to make sure that it truly works and makes a difference. So, some of those organizations are great. There are organizations, I'm the daughter of a librarian, so there's a group called First Book that, gives books to young people, make sure that that happens. But there are all kinds of organizations working in pretty much every field. So as long as you look out for the ones that are really good, there's fantastic work. While I love those organizations that are sort of the small breakout creative kinds of things, one of the challenges in this field is that everybody has a great idea for how they can change the world, and that's fantastic. But really, we need more consolidation among nonprofits because the resources aren't available for everybody. So, I would say if some of your listeners are thinking about, well, gee, I really want to make a difference and I want to start a nonprofit, the smartest thing really to do is to say, is there already an organization out there that's doing something similar that I could bring something to? We just don't necessarily need this proliferation of organizations. We need just more smart people going to the organizations that are already working well. And that might be as a professional, it might be as a board member, or as a volunteer. One of the really exciting changes that's happened, I think, over the last 10 or 15 years, especially, is this rise of pro bono volunteers that go well beyond law or, the things that we associate with pro bono. But, if you're somebody who has great communications expertise, technology skills, all the kinds of things a nonprofit can't afford, volunteering to offer those kinds of things makes a dramatic difference. And, unfortunately, at a lot of companies, they'll do things like say, our volunteer day is going to go to be clean up a park. Well, that's fine, but anybody can clean up a park, but not anybody can go redesign your website or protect you from, the cybersecurity risks your organization is facing. That's a more genuine and realistic way to help.
I'm glad you're talking about the volunteer side of it. I've had, as I mentioned, a lot of volunteer experience. It's just something I grew up with, something my parents believed in. I was fortunate that way. I talk to a lot of young people who will say, I just wish I could get some more leadership experience. I wish I could get more whatever experience. And I always say, okay, volunteer. Get There are nonprofit boards that would love to have you. There are almost any nonprofit would love to have your, like you said, your expertise. And then before you know it, you're meeting people in your community, you're feeling good about the difference you're making. And whether you're aware of it or not, you're getting incredible experience. And so I will add to what you say and encourage anybody out there who is looking for that next thing or they want to learn about or get some experience. It doesn't that just have to be at your workplace. Look around your community. Yeah. And one way to do it, I remember when I first moved to the state of Maine, looking at the number of organizations that the United Way supported. It's a great way to start looking around. And by the way, when I first did that in Maine, I thought, wow, there are a lot of nonprofits here. And sure enough, a lot of them have consolidated. And your advice, I've heard that from others who understand this space. Before you start your own nonprofit, look around and make sure there isn't one you should join. I'm glad we had a chance here to emphasize just how challenging the important work of nonprofits can be. And it's good to know that Stacy Palmer's Nonprofits Now podcast shares ideas about how founders and others can avoid burnout in their jobs and stay positive and productive during challenging times. Getting back to our conversation, we'll talk some more about the world of mega donors, one of whose names yours truly didn't quite get right off the bat. One of the things I'd like to talk about too, you mentioned before mega donors. They get a lot of the attention and rightly so. There are different models. You mentioned the Gates Foundation and Warren Buffett has put his funds into that. And then there's MacKenzie Bezos. And one of the differences there, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I've talked to folks who are in the nonprofit sector, running them or working in a nonprofit. And there's a lot of reasons they admire MacKenzie Bezos. One of the reasons is that, as I understand her gifting, first of all, it comes out of left field sometimes, which is kind of fun. I mean, she gets to play Santa Claus. I can't imagine anything more fun. But the other thing is, another thing is, there are fewer strings attached. A lot of nonprofits have said to me, yeah, you work your tail off to get the grant, and then you get the grant, and then there are there are metrics, and those are all well-intentioned and well and good, but they can also bog an organization down. And I'll end and let you talk in a second, but also, things like percentage of money that goes into overhead and those sorts of things. And the nonprofit person says, well, I get that, but I need people to do this. So can you talk about these different flavors and types, and MacKenzie Bezos in particular, or anyone else you want to talk about who's doing it different ways or good ways or better ways?
Yeah, you just captured some of the things that make MacKenzie really special. The gifts do come as a surprise. You can't apply for them. There's one small segment of her giving that you can apply for, and that was designed to identify the smaller groups that might not be on her radar. But otherwise, she does the research, and her team does research to figure out which organizations need help or working on causes that she cares about. And often the money goes to organizations that typically are not the recipients of large gifts. Colleges, universities, museums, hospitals. Those are the kinds of things that most really rich people, they know about. They're courted by the fundraisers. So that's why they get all of these mega gifts. But there are tons of organizations that an injection of funds can transform the work that they do. And she looks for them, finds them, puts them through a vetting process so that, she makes sure that they do deserve the money, but then grants them money. And as you said, the important part is that there are no strings. She's checked them out to say, I believe in you. It's not that she's just, being a fairy godmother and sprinkling it. She's done that vetting process. But for any donor, once you've figured out that you trust the organization, give them the money and say, do with it what you think you can do. And that's important because a lot of foundations have restrictions, and the government has restrictions on overhead as well. Well, that means you can't necessarily pay for things like if you're starting to think about experiments with AI and how that could transform your organization. Well, how do you write that into the grant necessarily? And are grant makers going to be okay with that? Also, a lot of foundations do 1-year grants, and then you have to apply again and again. And so, it's hard to hire people with the idea that I can only commit to you for 1 year. Well, you're not going to get the most talented people necessarily if you can't say that you're likely to have the job for 3 years or 5 years or whatever. And so all of those investments in, what many of us might think of as overhead, making sure you have great HR, great finance, great technology, those are important to any organization, especially to a nonprofit. And if you say all the money needs to go to the program, because I really care about school kids getting arts education, well, great. But, that not 100% of the money can go into that because you're not building a sustainable organization. And so, Mackenzie Scott's recognition that this is what groups need is incredibly important. I talked earlier about the burnout that nonprofit CEOs feel, and it comes from those restrictions that foundations and donors have. It's not, people think, oh, they're worn down by the fact that they can't solve these problems. It's not that. It's that friction of feeling like, where is my next dollar going to come from to pay my staff? And, am I going to have to be on this cycle of looking for more money and then trying to figure out how to deal with these restrictions? So, foundations could continue to give the same amount they're giving. And if they lost the restrictions, that would make a giant difference to, I would think, the productivity of this field. Now, I'd love to see them give more. Many of them can afford to give more, and money matters. But these restrictions are bogging people down. And they're based on the idea that, unfortunately, some of the people who are in the profession of giving away money, they don't think that nonprofits can be trusted. There are very few cases of embezzlement, misuse of funds. People have studied what's happened to Mackenzie Scott's gifts over time with the lack of restrictions. And in very few cases, there have been almost no problems, no misuse of funds. A few people who say, I would have done this differently if I had it to do over again. Well, that's fine. We all have that in organization. So, I hope that more philanthropists will start adopting that method and just trust in the organizations that they're supporting. If you don't trust them, you shouldn't give them money in the first place.
Bingo. Amen. And I'm glad you said Mackenzie Scott. I kept saying Bezos, and that's not her last name anymore for obvious reasons.
But without the Bezos, there would not have been the money.
Yes. But without Mackenzie, he wouldn't have done as well either.
Correct.
That's my belief. So I don't want to make this a Mackenzie Scott show, but you would know more than anyone. Has she done any interviews or press or?
I don't.
It's one of the more remarkable things I've ever seen. I don't even know what her voice sounds like.
We don't.
She has done all of this.
You're right. She writes these beautiful notes and letters, but she seems to have stopped doing that every single time she makes a big gift. She was doing that to explain her philosophy, but she keeps such a low profile. And I respect that sense of humility that she has, but she's not inspiring other donors quite as much as she could if she would just be a little bit more out there. People talk about Bill and Melinda Gates and Warren Buffett on the impact that they had with things like the Giving Pledge of encouraging others. Ted Turner, as we talked about, trying to give more money. You have to be a little out there to encourage other zillionaires to give money. They all have big egos. And so I do wish she would just talk out publicly a bit to show that her model is really working.
Yeah, Ted never had trouble speaking out publicly.
No,
he went a little too far. I'm embarrassed that I referred to Mackenzie Scott by her former married name, and Stacy was very gracious in the way she acknowledged my mistake. After recovering from my misstep, I was interested to hear what Stacy said about the downside of Miss Scott's privacy. I've always admired the way she stays out of the spotlight, but Stacy adds that in doing this, she's missing an opportunity to spread the word about the power of the work she's doing and the satisfaction that surely must come from it. Now, to the final segment of my blue sky conversation with Stacy Palmer. So, you've seen so much change in the world of philanthropy. As you look forward now, this is a tough question because we live in very tumultuous times. Are there trends that you're seeing? Do you think there will be more, cuts from federal government and more individuals having to step up? Do you worry that this trend of only 50% of Americans, is that going to drop? Is that going to bounce back? What do you see? It's an unfair question because no one has a crystal ball. But if you did, are there trends that you see emerging that you think will continue in the next few years?
Yeah. Well, I definitely think that as people see the impact of cuts in their communities, I think, sadly, because journalists don't cover nonprofits very much, most people don't know about the nonprofits in their communities that they count on. And they're going to see more of them fail. The local food bank isn't going to be able to do the things that it was doing. I mean, the demand side is going to be incredibly high if some of these cuts stay in place. And so there's just not going to be that capability to continue to serve. So we'll start seeing the impact of it. And I do think people are generous and are going to want to give and support the causes that they care about. So I do think we'll see a surge in giving. I especially hope it's of those who have means, which unfortunately, some of the giving by the merely affluent versus, we often look at the wealthy, the zillionaires, but there's a lot that would happen if people who are comfortable and have enough to give, if they would make some gifts to the organizations that they care about. Some of that will come from fundraisers getting smarter at identifying them and how they make their case to the people who can give $10,000 a year and can afford to do that. So, I think if nonprofits get smarter about getting their message out, if media organizations do a better job of saying, here are important organizations that are struggling. Here's how you can make a difference. And to understand, when I use that word struggling, they're not struggling because they're incompetent or any of those things. They're struggling because there just aren't enough resources and there's too much demand for their services. If there's, better coverage of that, I think people will respond. We have seen some real booms in the economy that mean that many people have the money to be able to give more. We have really two young generations that are incredibly interested in saving the world and changing things. I don't think we've really had that of the back-to-back generations of young people who are so interested in social change. So they're going to throw themselves into it. They're going to invent new ways of doing things. That's going to attract more resources, and we'll have more talent probably than ever before. That's what makes me optimistic that we are going to see great changes, but there's going to be pressure, and nonprofits are going to need to reinvent themselves in a lot of ways. That parts of it will be difficult. Some good organizations, unfortunately, probably will die. But reinvention is good for almost every organization. You asked me about how we got started, and it was after the Reagan era cut back a lot of spending on nonprofits, and they had to become more resilient. And that's why they hired so many more fundraisers and they became more professionalized. And now we see a boom in all of the kinds of things we take for granted. There were not as many of these fundraising walkathons and all these events and other things that we can all participate in. That's a really new phenomenon in the last 40 years. And organizations got really good at it because they had to. And so I'm not sure what the change is. I think it's going to be much more technology based. Whatever things we can figure out that AI can do to bring efficiencies and effectiveness, I do think we're going to see a changed world, of the world of doing good. And then we have a massive transfer of wealth that's happening. Trillions and trillions of dollars are going to transfer. And that means money's going to flow to charity. We have traditionally, even though we talked about the trend that more people are giving while they're living, a lot of people aren't. And so they certainly are preparing the next generation for giving. There's so many yachts and mansions and things that you can buy, and they don't need to do that to a certain extent. They probably left their kids very comfortable, their grandchildren, and they're raising them in ways that they want them to be socially responsible and think about that. So, I think there will be an infusion of funds in this field, and that will make a difference as well. And that infusion of funds coming from a new generation of donors also means more new thinking. So all of that, I think it's going to be challenging, but I do think that what we're going to see overall is something that's pretty positive. I'm not sure it's going to be in my lifetime, but it certainly will be, in the people who are in their 20s, 30s, and 40s now.
Well, you paint an optimistic picture, which I embrace. I appreciate. So Nonprofits Now, I assume, is a podcast you can get wherever you get your podcasts. If people want to learn more,
you can.
How about the Chronicle of Philanthropy? If people want to subscribe or get, how can they find that?
We're at philanthropy.com.
You have philanthropy.com. That's a
We
fantastic
do. We got it
URL. Easy
now
peasy.
People need to be able to spell philanthropy, and I have to say the number of people who don't know the word,
oh my goodness,
and who sometimes mix it up with philandering or other kinds of things.
Philandering.com is a whole other website, I'm sure.
That would be
Let's
a whole different business. That's not what we're talking about today.
Well, Stacy, it's been a real pleasure. You do great work. You really articulate your take on this field beautifully, and I can't thank you enough. I know you're busy, and I appreciate you taking time to be on the show.
Thank you. I really appreciate your doing this and also spreading the word that optimism matters. Otherwise, we won't get anywhere. So thank you for what you do.
Amen. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Let's hope Stacy is accurate in her prediction that for a variety of reasons, there will be a surge in charitable giving in the coming years. And I know she's right about the resilience of nonprofits. And as she says, this is driven largely by optimism, without which, she says, we won't get anywhere. Amen to that. I hope you enjoyed this blue sky conversation with Stacy Palmer. Before you go, please leave us a rating and review. These help us keep making our shows better, and they help listeners come and find us. While you're at it, you might want to subscribe to Blue Sky wherever you get your podcasts. Sign up for the Blue Sky Weekend newsletter at theoptimisminstitute.com and follow us on social media. All graphic design and cover art for Blue Sky and the Optimism Institute are provided by Crush Graphics. That's Crush with a K, if you'd like to check out more of their fantastic work at crushgraphics.com. And all Blue Sky episodes are made possible by the incredible editing and mixing done by the team at Sound On, Sound Off. You can learn more about their work at soundonsoundoff.com. Until next time, I'm the founder of the Optimism Institute and host of Blue Sky, Bill Burke, and I thank you for listening.